January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest. 2:47 in the morning. Major Friedrich Steiner stood in the frozen darkness of a Belgian farmhouse, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Through the shattered window, he watched the western horizon. It should have been black, it should have been silent. Instead, the night glowed with a dull orange pulse, and the earth trembled with a rhythm that never ceased. The sound was not the thunder of artillery barrages. Those came and went, rose and fell like storm waves. This was different. This was mechanical, constant, unending. The grinding of 10,000 engines that never stopped. The metallic clanking of treads on frozen roads. The diesel heartbeat of an army that refused to sleep. Steiner had been an officer in the Wehrmacht for 11 years. He had seen the Blitzkrieg tear through Poland in weeks, had watched Paris fall in days, had stood on the cliffs of Cavre and looked across the Channel at an England that seemed within reach. He had learned to read the patterns of warfare ebb and flow, the attack and consolidation, the advance and the necessary pause. Every army needed rest. Every force required time to regroup, to resupply, to let exhausted men close their eyes and remember they were human. This was not doctrine. This was biology. This was reality. But reality, it seemed, had crossed the Atlantic with a different set of rules. He pulled his coat tighter and turned to his adjutant, Lieutenant Hans Volkmann, who was studying a map by candlelight. "How long?" Steiner asked, though he already knew the answer would offer no comfort. 72 hours, Herr Major Volkmann replied, his voice hollow. 72 hours without stopping. They broke through our lines at 3 points simultaneously. Every time we establish a defensive position, they hit us from a direction we didn't anticipate. Every time we retreat to regroup, they're already there, waiting. It's as if they don't need to sleep, as if they don't need to rest. Steiner nodded slowly. He had heard the reports from other sectors. The American Third Army, commanded by General George S. Patton, Jr., had done something unprecedented. In the midst of winter, in the worst weather conditions the region had seen in decades, during what was supposed to be a quiet period of consolidation, Patton had pivoted his entire army 90 degrees north and launched a counteroffensive that military theorists would later call impossible. His force had disengaged from one battle, turned through ice and snow, and smashed into the southern flank of the German Bulge with a ferocity that seemed to mock the laws of logistics, human endurance, and military convention. But it wasn't just the speed of the maneuver that unsettled German commanders, it was what came after. It was the realization that the American army didn't operate like any force they had encountered before, that Wehrmacht had fought the Russians, who threw waves of men forward with brutal determination. They had fought the British, who advanced with methodical precision and careful coordination. But the Americans brought something else to the battlefield. They brought abundance. They brought machinery. They brought a kind of industrial momentum that transformed war from a contest of courage and strategy into something closer to a force of nature. To understand the terror that gripped German officers in those January nights, one must first understand what they expected. That Wehrmacht had studied American military capability extensively. German intelligence officers had pored over reports from the First World War, had analyzed American industrial output, had assessed the quality of their training and equipment. The consensus was cautiously optimistic. Yes, the Americans had resources. Yes, they had numbers. But they lacked the hardened experience of European armies. They lacked the ideological discipline that had been hammered into German and Soviet soldiers alike. They were soft, these Americans. They came from a culture of comfort, of individual liberty, of democratic inefficiency. They would fight, certainly, but they would fight like civilians in uniform, bravely perhaps, but without the cold professionalism required for sustained warfare. This assessment was not entirely unfounded. Early engagements in North Africa had shown American units struggling with coordination and tactics. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces had handed the U.S. the Second Corps a devastating defeat, sending American troops into chaotic retreat and validating Wehrmacht assumptions about American inexperience. German officers had filed reports noting that while American equipment was impressive, American soldiers seemed reluctant to take casualties, quick to surrender when outflanked, lacking the fanatical determination that drove German units to fight to the last man. But those reports were written in 1943. By 1945, everything had changed. What German officers failed to anticipate was not American fighting spirit that could be cultivated, trained, hardened by experience. What they failed to anticipate was the sheer material superiority that America could bring to bear. And more importantly, the doctrine that evolved to weaponize that superiority. The United States was not just producing more tanks, more trucks, more ammunition than Germany. It was producing them at a rate that seemed to defy economic logic. By 1944, American factories were rolling out aircraft at a rate of 1 every 5 minutes. Liberty ships were being constructed in days rather than months. The industrial capacity that had built skyscrapers and automobiles and refrigerators had been turned toward war, and the result was a logistical avalanche that no European power could match. But resources alone don't win wars. The Soviet Union had vast resources, yet their offensives still followed predictable patterns: massive buildups, overwhelming assaults, followed by pauses to consolidate and resupply. The British had sophisticated logistics, yet their advances were careful, measured, and always mindful of supply lines and defensive positions. The Americans, under commanders like Patton, developed something different. They developed a doctrine of continuous operation. They realized that if you had enough trucks, enough fuel, enough supplies moving constantly forward, you could eliminate the traditional rhythm of warfare. You could attack not just during the day, but through the night. You could advance not just until your men were tired, but around the clock, rotating units so that the enemy never got a moment to breathe, to dig in, to recover. That this was Patton's genius, and it was built on a foundation of American abundance. George S. Patton Jr. was not a man given to moderation. Born into a military family, obsessed with history and the great commanders of antiquity, he had studied war the way some men study religion. He believed in speed, in aggression, in the moral superiority of offensive action. He famously told his officers, "A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week." He despised hesitation. He loathed defensive thinking. He saw warfare as a contest of will as much as resources, and he believed that the side that moved faster hit harder, and never gave the enemy time to think, would inevitably prevail. But Patton was also he understood that his aggressive doctrine only worked if he had the logistical infrastructure to support it. And here the American system shone. While German armies in late 1944 were scrounging for fuel, rationing ammunition, pulling horses from farms to supplement their dwindling motor transport, Patton's Third Army was drowning in supplies. The Red Ball Express, a massive trucking operation, was moving thousands of tons of supplies daily from Normandy beaches to frontline units. American engineers were rebuilding bridges and railways at speeds that astonished observers. Every American division had more trucks than an entire German corps. Every American battalion had more radios, ensuring instant communication and coordination. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted on December 16, 1944, the German High Command believed they had achieved total surprise. They had massed 28 divisions in the Ardennes Forest, a region the Allies considered too difficult for major operations. The initial assault was devastating. American units were overrun, communication broke down, thousands were captured. For a brief moment, it seemed the Wehrmacht had recaptured the lightning of their earlier victories. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding the operation, I believed that if they could reach the Meuse River and drive onto Antwerp, they could split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. But at Allied headquarters in Verdun on December 19th, Patton stunned his fellow commanders by promising to disengage his entire Third Army from its current operations in the Saar region and attack north into the German flank within 48 hours. Other generals in the room thought he was being theatrical, overconfident. To turn an army of over 250,000 men 90 degrees, to move them through winter roads clogged with ice and snow, to coordinate an attack involving 3 full divisions without the usual weeks of planning, it was absurd. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, always cautious, suggested it would take at least a week. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, looked skeptical. Patton met Eisenhower's eyes and said, "This time the crowd has stuck his head in a meat grinder." Then he added, with the absolute confidence that defined his personality, "And I've got hold of the handle." He wasn't bluffing. What happened next has been dissected by military historians for decades, but the raw mechanics of it remain staggering. Patton's staff had already anticipated the possibility of a German counteroffensive and had prepared contingency plans. Within hours of the Verdun meeting, orders were racing down the chain of command. The 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division began their movement north. Engineers leapfrogged ahead to clear roads and mark routes. Military police directed traffic at every crossroads, ensuring that the massive flow of men and vehicles didn't dissolve into chaos. Trucks moved day and night, headlights taped to narrow slits to avoid attracting German aircraft, drivers navigating icy roads in near-total darkness. On December 22nd, just 72 hours after the Verdun Conference, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division smashed into the southern flank of the German salient near the town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division had been surrounded and holding on by sheer determination. The speed of Patton's response shocked the German commanders. They had been so confident in the Allied inability to react quickly that they had allocated minimal forces to watch their southern flank. Now, suddenly, they were fighting a two-front battle, and the Americans weren't coming cautiously, they were coming in waves that never seemed to stop. This was when German officers first began to notice something deeply unsettling. American attacks didn't follow the traditional pattern. Normally, an assault would begin at dawn, rage through the day, and taper off at dusk as both sides pulled back to rest, resupply, and prepare for the next day's fighting. Night was sanctuary. Night was when you tended wounds, ate hot food if you were lucky, and tried to steal a few hours of sleep in frozen foxholes or ruined buildings. But Patton's units didn't stop at dusk. They kept coming. They attacked through the night. using searchlights bounced off clouds to create artificial moonlight, illuminating the battlefield in an eerie shifting glow. They used their superior radios to coordinate movements in the darkness, something German units, with their more limited communication equipment, struggled to counter, and when one American unit was exhausted, another rolled forward to take its place. The individual soldiers still needed sleep, but the army as a whole became a perpetual motion machine, a grinding, relentless force that gave the Germans no chance to regroup. Lieutenant Colonel Rolf Heinz, commanding a battalion of the 5th Panzer Division, wrote in his diary on January 3, 1945, "We are being destroyed not by superior tactics, but by exhaustion. Every time we establish a position, we are hit within hours. We cannot sleep. We cannot rest. Our men are hallucinating from fatigue. Yesterday, one of my sergeants reported an entire American tank division approaching from the east. When we investigated, it was a single jeep. His mind is breaking. We are all breaking." This was psychological warfare through logistical superiority. The Germans weren't just being outfought, they were being outsupplied, outmechanized. And for soldiers who had been taught that German discipline and German efficiency were the pinnacle of military virtue, the realization was devastating. The object that symbolized this American abundance, the recurring image that haunted German soldiers and officers alike, was not a weapon. It was a can. Specifically, the simple tin can that contained American rations. In the winter of 1944-45, German soldiers were hungry. Not starving, not yet, but chronically, knowingly hungry in a way that sapped strength and morale. Wehrmacht rations had been reduced multiple times as Allied bombing ravaged German supply lines and as the Eastern Front devoured resources. A typical German soldier's daily ration consisted of 700 grams of bread, often heavy and dark, stretching tight in the stomach without truly satisfying. A small portion of preserved meat or sausage, when available. Perhaps some margarine, some ersatz coffee made from acorns or barley. Calories were calculated down to the minimum required for survival. Hunger was a constant companion, a dull ache that colored every thought and every action. Then they encountered American supply dumps, or they overran American positions in the initial stages of the bulge, and they found abundance that seemed obscene. American soldiers ate 3 substantial meals a day even in combat conditions. The ration, the standard American field ration, contained not just food but luxuries, cigarettes, chewing gum, toilet paper, even small packages of instant coffee. Each ration provided over 3,000 calories, nearly double what German soldiers received. But it was the ration that truly symbolized American industrial might. These cans, produced by the millions, contained complete meals, meat and beans, meat and vegetables, beef stew, pork, sausage. The cans were portable, durable, and required no special preparation. An American soldier could eat hot food heated over a small stove, or eat cold food straight from the can if necessary. The cans themselves became valuable commodities. German soldiers would risk their lives to scavenge American supply dumps, not for weapons or ammunition, but for food. Major Steiner remembered the first time one of his men had brought him an American ration can, captured from a destroyed truck during the opening days of the offensive. They had heated it carefully over a small fire and divided the contents among 6 officers. The meat had been tender, swimming in rich gravy. There had been actual vegetables, not the dried, reconstituted ghosts they were accustomed to. One officer had actually wept, not from the food itself, but from the crushing realization of what it represented. If the Americans could afford to give every soldier this much food, every single day, without exception, what did that say about their overall capability? If they could produce millions upon millions of these cans, stamp them out in factories with the same casual efficiency they produced automobiles, and ship them across an ocean, and distribute them to soldiers at the front faster than German supply lines could move, dried bread 30 kilometers, what chance did the Reich have? The can was not just food, it was a message. It said, we can outproduce you, we can outlast you, we can afford to feed our soldiers as if they were middle-class civilians while yours go hungry, and there is nothing you can do to stop us. When Patton's units began their counteroffensive, German soldiers who were captured or who surrendered told interrogators the same thing, over and over. They weren't afraid of dying in battle. They were afraid of being ground down, exhausted and starving, by an enemy that never seemed to run out of anything. The terror German officers felt was not irrational panic. It was the cold, calculated realization that they were losing not because they were inferior soldiers, but because they were fighting an entirely different kind of war. The Wehrmacht had been designed for swift, decisive campaigns. Blitzkrieg doctrine emphasized concentration of force, rapid movement, and the destruction of enemy armies through superior tactics and operational maneuver. It was a doctrine born from Germany's strategic position in the heart of Europe, surrounded by potential enemies, unable to afford long wars of attrition. German military thinking was brilliant, elegant, and fundamentally dependent on achieving victory quickly before resources ran out. The Americans had no such constraints. They came from a continent protected by oceans, with industrial capacity that dwarfed any European nation, with access to raw materials from around the globe. They didn't need to win quickly. They could afford to be methodical, to trade material for lives, to simply keep coming until the enemy collapsed from exhaustion. And under Patton, they had found a commander who could combine American material abundance with aggressive, relentless operational tempo. The numbers tell the story. During the Battle of the Bulge, from December 16, 1944, to January 25, 1945, the Germans committed virtually all their remaining strategic reserves in the West. Over 400,000 men, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, thousands of artillery pieces. They achieved initial surprise and made significant gains. But by the end of January, the Bulge had been eliminated, and German losses were catastrophic: 100,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead, 800 tanks destroyed, the cream of the Wehrmacht's remaining panzer divisions reduced to hollow shells. American losses were also severe: some 80,000 casualties, including nearly 20,000 killed. But here was the difference. By February, American units were rebuilt, re-equipped, and ready to continue offensive operations. Replacement soldiers arrived from training camps in the United States. New tanks rolled off ships at Antwerp and were at the front within days. Ammunition stocks were replenished so rapidly that artillery units never had to ration shells. The American army absorbed its losses and continued grinding forward as if nothing had happened. The Germans, by contrast, had shot their last bolt. The reserves expended in the Ardennes could not be replaced. The fuel burned in the offensive was fuel that would be desperately needed for defense. The tanks destroyed could not be rebuilt. German industry was crumbling under constant Allied bombing. Raw materials were unobtainable, and even if factories could produce new vehicles, there was no fuel to run them. After the Bulge, German forces in the West were condemned to a fighting retreat, constantly on the defensive, constantly outmaneuvered, never given time to establish a coherent defensive line. And through it all, Patton's army kept moving, kept attacking, never seemed to sleep. Captain Wilhelm Drescher, a staff officer with the German 7th Army, was captured by American forces on January 28, 1945, near the town of Sankt Vith. In his interrogation, preserved in U.S. Army records, he provided a revealing glimpse into the German perspective. "You must understand, we are not defeated by your courage or your tactics. Your tanks are good, yes, but our Panthers and Tigers are better in direct combat. Your soldiers are brave, but ours have fought across half of Europe and Russia. What defeats us is that you never stop. We establish a defensive line. We prepare to hold, and before we can even finish digging our positions, you are hitting us again. At night, when soldiers should rest, you continue attacking. We hear your trucks all night, bringing supplies, bringing reinforcements, bringing more fuel, more ammunition, more food, always more. We cannot match this. We have fuel for 3 days of operations, and then we must wait for supplies that may never come. You have fuel for months. We calculate every shell we fire. You fire thousands without counting. This is not war as we know it. This is industrial destruction." Drescher's words were echoed by other captured officers. There was a recurring theme in their testimonies, a sense that they were fighting not an army, but a system. The individual American soldier might be no better or worse than his German counterpart, but the system that supported him, the trucks, the supply chains, the radios, the replacement depots, the medical services, the sheer abundance of everything created an entity greater than the sum of its parts, and Patton, more than any other Allied commander, understood how to weaponize this system. His headquarters became a model of efficient brutality. He demanded daily reports on fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, vehicle readiness, casualty rates, all distilled into simple numbers that could be assessed at a glance. If a unit reported it was too tired to continue attacking, Patton would order a fresh unit to leapfrog forward and maintain pressure. If a division commander said he needed more time to prepare, Patton would relieve him and find someone willing to move immediately. He was not beloved by his soldiers. His demands were too harsh, his discipline too strict, his willingness to sacrifice men for operational tempo too callous. When they respected him because he delivered victory, and because he never asked them to do anything unless he had ensured they had the supplies and support to do it. There's a recorded incident from January 7, 1945, that illuminates Patton's philosophy. One of his division commanders, Brigadier General Hugh Gaffey, radioed that his 4th Armored Division had been in continuous combat for 3 weeks, that his men were exhausted, that casualties were mounting, and that he needed time to rest and refit. Patton's response was immediate. "Hugh, the enemy is more tired than you are. Keep attacking. I'm sending you fresh battalions and hot meals tonight. Your men can sleep when the Germans are dead." It was harsh. It was arguably cruel. But it was also effective. Gaffey's division continued, pressing forward, and within 2 days, the German units opposing them collapsed, falling back in disorder because they simply could not maintain coherent resistance against an enemy that never relented. This relentless tempo had a profound psychological effect. German soldiers began to dread not the American attacks themselves, but the inevitability of them. They knew that no matter how well they fought, no matter how many American tanks they destroyed or how many positions they held, the Americans would come again, and again, and again. There was no victory, only delay. There was no rest, only brief pauses before the next assault. The war became a form of torture through attrition, and morale crumbled not from fear, but from despair. The transformation in German perception of American military capability happened gradually, then all at once. In 1943, Wehrmacht officers had returned from North Africa with stories that confirmed their prejudices. Americans were soft, inexperienced, reliant on material superiority to compensate for tactical weakness. By late 1944, after Normandy, after the breakout from the hedgerows, after the encirclement at Falaise, those stories had changed. American units were learning, adapting, becoming dangerous. But there was still a sense that in equal numbers, with equal resources, German troops would prevail. The bulge shattered that illusion completely. The Americans had been surprised, had taken terrible losses, had seen entire regiments captured or destroyed. By traditional military logic, they should have needed weeks to recover, to consolidate, to carefully prepare a camp. Instead, within days, Patton's army had struck like a thunderbolt, and it had never stopped striking. The psychological impact on German soldiers and officers was profound and permanent. After January 1945, captured German soldiers spoke about Americans differently. There was a fatalism in their testimonies, a sense that they were fighting an inevitable force. One captured sergeant from the 2nd Panzer Division told his interrogators, "We used to joke that every American soldier had a jeep and a refrigerator. Now we don't joke. We've seen your supply dumps. We've seen trucks lined up for kilometers, filled with food and fuel and ammunition. We've counted your planes, your tanks, your artillery. You could lose half of everything you have and still overwhelm us. How do you fight an enemy like that?" The question was rhetorical, but it revealed the core of German despair. They couldn't fight an enemy like that, not in the long term, not when the enemy could afford to operate 24 hours a day, to replace losses overnight, to feed its soldiers luxury rations while yours went hungry, to attack and attack and attack until you simply had nothing left. This realization spread through the Wehrmacht like a virus. Officers who had once spoken confidently of new wonder weapons, of political settlements, of ways to turn the tide, now spoke in private about how to survive, how to surrender to the Americans rather than the Russians, how to get their families to safety before the end came. The ideology that had sustained them, the belief in German superiority, in the necessity of their cause, in the inevitable victory of will over material, corroded under the relentless pressure of American abundance. Patton's army became the symbol of that abundance. Every German unit that faced the Third Army came away with the same impression. These Americans were not just soldiers. They were the vanguard of a society that could produce anything, in any quantity, and ship it anywhere in the world. They were the military arm of factories and farms and oil fields that stretched across a continent. Fighting them was like fighting a machine that could not be stopped, only delayed, and even delay was temporary. The symbolism of the tin can recurred throughout German accounts of this period. Soldiers wrote letters home, describing American rations with a mixture of envy and resignation. Officers included details about captured American supply levels in their situation reports, not as tactical intelligence, but as evidence of the hopelessness of their position. The can became shorthand for everything the Reich had failed to provide its soldiers and everything the Americans took for granted. There's a particularly poignant letter, preserved in the German military archives, written by Lieutenant Ernst Bauer to his wife on January 15, 1945. He would be killed 3 days later in an American artillery barrage. Liebste Maria, we captured an American truck yesterday. It was filled with rations, hundreds of cans of meat and vegetables, boxes of chocolate, cartons of cigarettes, even fresh bread somehow preserved in wax paper. The men fell on it like starving wolves. We divided the spoils as best we could, but there was not enough for everyone, and fights broke out. I took a single can of beef stew and ate it slowly, trying to make it last. It was the best meal I've had in 6 months. And then I wept, because I realized that for the Americans, this is ordinary. This is what they eat every day. We are fighting men who have so much they can afford to waste it. I found a half-empty can thrown aside by one of our soldiers, still with food in it. He had eaten his fill and simply discarded the rest. When has a German soldier ever been able to discard food? What are we doing, Maria? What are we fighting for? We are told we are defending civilization, defending the fatherland, but civilization feeds its soldiers and we are starving. I don't know if I will survive this war, but I know we cannot win it. The cans have shown me that Bauer's letter was one of thousands that expressed similar sentiments. The physical hunger German soldiers experienced was terrible, but it was the symbolic hunger, the realization that their nation, their cause, their entire way of life was insufficient that truly broke their spirit. And Patton's army, grinding forward day and night, never sleeping, never stopping, was the instrument of that revelation. By late January 1945, the German offensive in the Ardennes had been completely reversed. Patton's Third Army had not only relieved Bastogne but had pushed deep into German-held territory, reclaiming ground and destroying German units with methodical efficiency. Other Allied armies, inspired by Patton's success and supplied by the same abundant logistics, pressed forward on other fronts. The Rhine River, the last major geographical barrier protecting Germany itself, was now within reach. German officers knew the war was lost. Some had known it for months, or even years, but had continued fighting out of duty, or ideology, or fear of what would happen if they stopped. Now, facing an enemy that never slept, that never ran out of supplies, that could afford to simply keep coming until nothing remained, even the most fanatical began to question the point of continued resistance. Major Steiner survived the war. He surrendered to American forces on April 2, 1945, near the town of Limburg. In post-war interviews, he was asked about his experiences facing Patton's army. His answer was measured, almost academic. General Patton understood something fundamental that our commanders did not. War is not simply about courage or tactics or even strategy. At its core, war is about resources and how efficiently you can bring them to bear. The Americans had vast resources, yes, but so did the Russians, and we fought the Russians to a standstill for years. What made Patton different was his refusal to allow traditional rhythms of warfare. He understood that if you have abundant supplies, you can maintain constant pressure. And constant pressure breaks armies not through dramatic battles, but through accumulated exhaustion. We could win individual engagements. We could destroy American tanks and kill American soldiers, but we could never rest. We could never recover. We could never build up reserves for a counterattack. And eventually, we broke, not because we were cowards, but because we were human, and humans need sleep. Patton's army never slept. That was his genius, and that was our doom. The epilogue of this story is not about battles won or territories captured. It's about the collision of two worldviews, two systems, two fundamentally different approaches to organizing human society and projecting power. The Third Reich was built on the idea that will could triumph over circumstance, that discipline and ideology could overcome material disadvantage, that a superior people led by superior leaders could dominate through sheer force of character. It was a philosophy that had worked in the short term, that had conquered much of Europe through brilliant tactics and fanatic determination. But it was also a philosophy that could not sustain itself, because it was fundamentally at odds with reality. You cannot feed an army on ideology. You cannot fuel tanks with willpower. You cannot manufacture ammunition through discipline. The United States, by contrast, was built on abundance, on the idea that prosperity was achievable, that production could be scaled, that systems could be optimized to deliver goods and services efficiently. It was a society that valued innovation and efficiency not as military virtues, but as economic necessities. When that society turned its productive capacity toward war, it created something unprecedented, an army that was supported not by the maximum effort of a mobilized nation, but by the casual overflow of an industrial economy operating at high capacity. Patton's army never slept because America could afford to keep it awake. The trucks that ran all night burned fuel pumped from Texas, oil fields that produced more petroleum than the rest of the world combined. The rations that kept soldiers fed came from farms in the Midwest that grew more food than the population could consume. The ammunition that artillery crews fired without counting was manufactured in factories that had been producing consumer goods just years before and would return to producing them shortly after the war. The system was so productive that sustaining a massive military campaign was not a burden, but merely a redirection of output. For German officers, trained to think in terms of scarcity, to calculate every resource, to plan meticulously because there was no margin for error, encountering this abundance was psychologically devastating. It wasn't just that they were losing, it was that they were losing to a system that didn't seem to be trying very hard, that could afford to be wasteful, that could make mistakes and simply throw more resources at the problem until it was solved. The tin can, that simple cylinder of stamped metal containing meat and vegetables, became the symbol of this gulf. It represented not just food, but a civilization that could afford to package millions of meals individually, ship them across oceans, and distribute them to individual soldiers as if they were customers in a store. It represented an economy so robust that feeding an army was merely a logistical challenge, not a strategic crisis. And when German soldiers opened those cans, when they tasted food they hadn't eaten in years, when they saw the casual abundance of American supply dumps, something changed in them. Ideology crumbled, propaganda became transparent. The promises of their leaders that German discipline would triumph, that will would overcome material disadvantage, that victory was inevitable revealed themselves as lies. The Americans had proven a simple, brutal truth. Abundance is power. The ability to produce more, to supply more, to sustain more, to simply outlast your enemy through sheer material superiority, that was the ultimate military advantage, and no amount of tactical brilliance or soldier courage could overcome it indefinitely. Patton died in December 1940 in a car accident in Germany, just months after the war he had fought so brilliantly had ended. His legacy is complex. He was a difficult man, often offensive, sometimes cruel, obsessed with glory and intolerant of weakness. But he understood something essential about modern warfare that many of his contemporaries missed, that logistics is strategy, that supply lines are as important as front lines, that an army that can maintain tempo indefinitely will eventually defeat an army that must pause to rest. The German officers who faced him learned this lesson the hardest way possible. They learned it in the freezing nights of January 1945, when they listened to American engines running without end, when they counted the hours since they had last slept and realized their enemy was counting nothing. They learned it when they opened captured American rations and tasted the proof of their own nation's insufficiency. They learned it when they finally surrendered, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked everything else. The tin can endured as a symbol long after the war, in memoirs and histories, in interviews and documentaries. Former German soldiers returned again and again to those simple cylinders of food as the moment they understood the war was lost. Not when Berlin fell, not when Hitler died, but when they held in their hands physical proof that America could afford to give every soldier luxuries that German officers could only dream of, and still have more left over, still keep producing, still keep supplying an army that never needed to sleep. Freedom, it turned out, was well-fed. Democracy, it turned out, was abundant. And abundance, in the end, was unstoppable. The lights on the western horizon never dimmed, the engines never stopped, and the army that never slept ground forward, relentless as sunrise, inevitable as seasons, until there was nothing left to oppose it but memory and ruins and the bitter knowledge that will alone, no matter how fierce, could not overcome the simple power of having more. In the darkness of that Belgian farmhouse, Major Steiner had understood this truth before most of his countrymen. He had heard the engines and known what they meant. He had seen the lights and understood the future they illuminated, and he had turned away from the window, pulling his thin coat tighter against the cold, and prepared for the dawn he knew would bring not hope, but the continuation of an ending that had already been written in tin cans and diesel fuel in the grinding treads of an army that refused to grant mercy or respite or sleep. The war would continue for 4 more months, but on that January night, in that frozen farmhouse, it was already over. The only question remaining was how many more would die before everyone else realized what Steiner already knew, that you cannot defeat abundance with sacrifice, that you cannot overcome systems with will, and that an army that never sleeps will eventually devour everything in its path, not through malice, but through the simple, terrible logic of having more fuel, more food, more ammunition, more men, more trucks, more time, more of everything that matters when nations commit themselves to total war and only one side can afford to sustain it indefinitely. The tin can sat on Steiner's makeshift desk, empty now, its contents long consumed by desperate soldiers. He looked at it in the candlelight, this small cylinder that had crossed an ocean to feed an enemy and break a nation. He thought about throwing it away, but he couldn't. It was evidence. It was testimony. It was the truth in metal form that the Americans were coming. They would not stop, they would not sleep, and when they finally arrived, they would bring more cans, more supplies, more abundance than any ideology could counter. He blew out the candle and sat in the darkness, listening to the engines that never stopped, waiting for the dawn that would bring more of the same, and more after that, and more forever until the mathematics of abundance had calculated their final, inevitable sum.